with Ted and Todd, two of my MVPs focusing on Power Apps, actually also trainers. Ted, I just did a presentation with at Microsoft Business Application Summit. And Todd, you missed it because you're on vacation. Tell us a little bit about that. And actually, why don't you go ahead and kick us off? Thank you very much, by the way, for doing these.
You're welcome. Thanks for the intro and welcome to the call, everybody. Yeah, I had a great vacation. Spent a week down at the beach in South Carolina and then a couple days up in the mountains in Tennessee. And the best part was there was no fire drill with work and I didn't even have to get the laptop out of my bag. That's my kind of vacation.
Nice.
Welcome everybody to this month's PowerApps Community Call. Today's June 19, 2019, and we have a great community call lined up for you today. And I am going to start sharing my screen here and walking everybody through it. So thank you for attending the call. It's good to see so many people joining here today. And about our community call, just a little bit to tell you about what this is like if you haven't been here before. We do this every month. We meet on the third Wednesday, and our next call will be on July 17th, same time, and probably also in the same place next month as well. Each time we do this call, we run through what the latest news and community contributions are in the PowerApps community. We get to meet folks on the product teams behind PowerApps, as well as experts in the field. And we do technical deep dives to teach folks how you can develop better PowerApps and neat functionality and features inside of the product. And then we have Q&A throughout in the chat. And if we do have time at the end of the session, we will take time to answer questions during the call as well. So today's agenda for our call is we'll just quickly introduce who's presenting on the call today. And then we're going to be walking through coding standards and guidelines for PowerApps. Essentially, what are some really good rules or best practices or standards and guidelines on how you can develop better PowerApps for yourself and the folks you develop them for. After that, we're going to get into the recent news and community activities, and then Ted and I will share our monthly tips this month. And as I mentioned before, we'll wrap up with QA then. So who do we got here today? Well, we have myself on the left there in the slide. You see that's me, Todd Baginski. I'm a partner and CTO at my company Canvas. You can reach out to me on Twitter or follow me on there and find me on YouTube as well. I make a lot of different PowerApps videos and share them there. And then we have also Chuck Sterling from Microsoft. Took the call off. There's Chuck. He's as excited as can be as usual. And today, happy to have my friend Ted Pattison, who I've known for over a decade now. Ted, welcome to the call.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
Ted, a little bit about yourself, please.
Well, I've been working as a developer and an educator for about 25 years, going back to the component object model days. Did a lot of work with you in the SharePoint phase, and now kind of moved into the Power Platform. But I do consulting work and I do a lot of training. At Critical Path Training, we have PowerApps and Power BI courses.
Awesome. So as you can see, everybody, we've got some great folks here today. And not just do we have people who are presenting on the call, but behind the scenes, we've got several PowerApps Community Call chat channel gurus, we like to call them. So we have Brian Dang from Microsoft, Eichel Mendoza, and Daniel Christian. If you'd like to be listed up here too and help out and answer questions for folks in the community call, please let me know and I'll add you to this slide. One of the cool things that we really like about this call and that we really try to hang our hat on with this call is it's a one-stop shop for you once a month. If you're blocked on PowerApps or have a question about how to do something, bring it to the chat and ask. You've got awesome experts from around the world here helping you at a moment's notice to get you unblocked and answer your questions about PowerApps. So thank you to everybody who's in the chat channel every month and this month doing that. We really appreciate you. And so does everyone on the call. Okay, so without any further introduction, let's get into the meat of our presentation today. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about coding standards and guidelines for PowerApps. And so the goals of these coding standards and guidelines here, they come from a white paper that I wrote with Pat Dunn from Microsoft. And we have the link to that white paper inside of this deck here. And as we wrote this white paper, Pat and I and several other of the PowerApps champions around the community provided input on it. And basically, our goals for the white paper were to give you information that allowed you to build Canvas PowerApps that were simple, readable, supportable, easy to deploy and administer inside of your environments, perform well, and very accessible and meet accessibility requirements. So that's what Ted and I are going to be talking about today, and how you can build PowerApps that meet these goals here. So I'm going to kick it off with a few slides here and a demo, and then Ted's going to jump in and do the same as well. We're going to start simple here. So the first thing that we'd like to share with you about this is when you're creating PowerApps, paying attention to how you name your screens is actually more important than you think. And the reason for that is because if someone is using a screen reader to use your PowerApp, these screen names are actually read aloud by the screen reader. So for example, if you're on what you see in the screenshot here, the welcome screen, and then you click a button that takes you to the Browse Customers screen. When you click the button to go to that screen, the screen reader will actually say, Browse Customers screen. And so it tells you where you're going. And so that's why it's so important to name them correctly. So when you name them, use spaces in the names. Don't put abbreviations in there because screen readers don't work with that. End the screen name with the word screen. And really talk about what you're using this screen for and what purpose it is, and that will really help you out. So that's a very quick tip to get us started today. The next one is more really about the coding. And so this one is about naming your controls inside of PowerApps. So you can use whatever coding convention you like for naming things, but just make sure you define and document one before you get started. You can use this list here that we provide in the white paper as a starting point. But if you do this and you make many PowerApps in your organization and everyone follows the same standard, anyone can pick up one of those PowerApps at any time and know what the heck those controls are at a moment's notice. So it's just like when you write code in C# or JavaScript, have a naming convention there. The next piece is about keeping screens maintainable. So each control name should be very easy to read and understand what you use it for. And you can see here in this screenshot, we're using the prefixes we talked about as well. You'll want to use grouping to isolate sets of the controls that you have that all work together to serve a single purpose. So for example, you can see here that these controls are part of the group named Group Search Toolbar. And inside of the PowerApp editor, this also makes your life easier because then you can collapse that group, and it just makes it easier to move around inside of the editor, find what you're looking for, and build your PowerApps. Next one is code naming conventions. So this gets back to similar what we were talking about with the names of the controls. But as you create variables and collections in PowerApps as well, your names there should also indicate the type, the purpose, and the scope of what those things are doing. So for example, you can name your collections to start with COL. And here's a screenshot of a whole bunch of collections in a PowerApp on the collections page in the backstage that demonstrate they all start with COL. Global variable names, start them out with the GBL prefix. Context variables, because they're local to a PowerApp page, we like to start them with LOC. So these kind of things just help you understand as you look at the code in your PowerApp what it's doing. Another one is really limiting the package size of your Power App. So this is actually the size of the Power App package that actually encapsulates all the things that make up your Power App. So before you go deploy your Power App, look through all the media collection inside your Power App, and if you're not using some of it, delete it. You can also consider using SVG images instead of image files. That can really cut down on the size of the package. You'll also want to think about the resolution based on the form factor of the Power App you're designing. So if I'm designing a tablet Power App, that's going to have a higher resolution than a phone form factor Power App. So maybe if I'm building a Power App in both of those form factors, and the tablet I use high resolution images because that one might also appear in a web browser. But on a phone, I don't need super high resolution usually. So you could actually swap out the image on the different Power Apps that you create for different form factors to reduce the package size. You'll also want to delete any unused screens. Sometimes we make screens. I know we all do it in our Power Apps as we're debugging and testing things. Delete them before you roll your Power App out. They just increase the package size and take it longer to download. Be careful not to delete any hidden screens that you put in there for configuration purposes, though. And then this last one is a really key point, is don't try to fit too much into one Power App. Sometimes Power Apps have a end user functionality capability and they have an administrator capability. It might be better to split your Power App into two Power Apps and have one Power App targeted at the end user and the other one is the administrator for how that Power App works. So think about that and try to keep your Power Apps lean. I love this one because this has got to be the easiest tip ever, is just go republish your Power Apps. The Power Platform is always being optimized by the Power Apps team. And to take advantage of the new optimizations that are introduced, sometimes you need to republish your Power Apps. And the reason why is because they want to make sure that as they put new optimizations into the Power Platform, they don't break any backward compatibility. So some of those new optimizations they put in the platform, they'll only apply when your Power App has been published as a certain version of Power Apps or newer. So if you schedule some time to periodically go republish your Power Apps, say once a month maybe, then you may find your Power Apps got quicker and all you did was go click the publish button. So those are all kind of very simple things that you can do with the Power App. These other things now, we're starting to get into a little bit more complexity and a little bit more thinking as a Power Apps developer and not just the developer in general. The first one we'd like to start with is app OnStart. So this particular property, it's really an event. And you can see it in the screenshot here where app is selected in the screen browser and OnStart is the name of the property. And here's some code inside of it. So this particular property and the code inside of it runs every time your Power App starts up. So just once per run. This gives you the ability to initialize state in the app when it starts up. Usually you'll put things like initializing global variables or collections, as you can see in this example here. And if you want to run this inside of the editor, just in the last month or two, the Power Apps team gave us the capability to right-click that and then run it right in the editor. Where before, you remember, Ted, we used to have to actually close the editor and then open the app back up again to get it to fire. Or make yourself a button that would run the same thing in OnStart. Yeah, so that's gotten a lot better. The thing to think about in OnStart is only put in here what you need to do. Keep it lean. Don't put in a whole ton of thing in OnStart, because if you do, it's going to take longer for your Power App to actually show up with its first page to the users that open it up. And that's not a good user experience anybody wants. The next thing is the OnVisible property. And again, although it's called a property, this is really an event. The code that you put into this property fires every time you navigate to the page where you put the code inside of here. So every page or screen in a Power App has this property. When you come to that page in the Power App, the code inside of this runs. We commonly use this to initialize our context variables and any collections that are specific to the page. I'd like to talk about a little anti-pattern here with OnVisible that you'll want to avoid. So let's imagine a situation where you're in a Power App and you're on this one page in the Power App and you fill out the form and you click the next button and it processes all that information you filled out and it saves it to places, maybe kicks off a workflow, and then it goes to the next page. Well, the pattern to avoid here is making the expensive calls before you go to that next page. Because your users will feel like, hey, what's going on? I just clicked that button. I'm supposed to go to the next page. It's just sitting here. It's not doing anything. So an example of what this anti-pattern might look like is this code you see here. So it's doing some code and then it's going out to Planner for every task in this collection and it's creating a task in Planner for them. Well, what if there were 100 tasks in that collection? That could take a long time. And then finally, after it gets through with all that code, then it's going to navigate to a page called Export Confirm. So this is a pattern you should probably avoid. And instead, here's a better way to use OnVisible. Instead of using those expensive calls before you load the next page, try to make the loading of that next page happen instantaneously. So imagine the code on the left is in the first page. I click that save button I talked about, and I immediately navigate to the next page with my navigate function. And then in the next page, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set a variable loading equal to true. And when that happens, I can either display a message box to queue off of that variable, or I can put a little spinner on the screen to let people know something's happening. And then check it out. Here's that same code that we talked about before. So then you run the code on the next page, and then you set your variable loading, I'm done loading, and you proceed on. And when you set the loading to false, that's when you can remove your spinner or whatnot. So in this pattern, somebody clicked the button on the previous page, they got instant gratification, they came to this page, and people are typically used to waiting for pages to load a little bit. So you tell them that's happening, do your work here, and then move on. The next thing is, this is really key to being a developer with PowerApps or Flow, and it's understanding delegation and how to make delegation work for you. And so delegation is really the act of pushing the work of doing something with data to the data source. And so that work usually is something like filtering or sorting data or aggregating data. So if you are using delegation properly, you're getting your data source, such as a SQL server, to filter and sort or aggregate the data before it sends that data back to the app. So in turn, it takes the processing power of those things off of the client in the Power App and puts it on a beefy server so it goes quicker to happen, sends you less data back so you don't have to do it client side in the Power App, and you get better performance out of it. Now, one thing to keep in mind is not all connectors support delegation though. If you have a connector and it doesn't support delegation, it's only going to return you 500 items. So if you're using search to look through data, if you're searching through 500 items, the first 500 items of a data set that were returned, you're not searching through what's after 500 items in your data set. So you've got unpredictable results and inaccurate results. And it also performs worse to use data sources that are not delegable. So whenever possible, try to use delegation. The next thing is this Ted and I like to call this the famous PowerApps blog post. And this one is by Mehdi from Microsoft. And he wrote this great blog post on how to think about performance in PowerApps. So I encourage you to check it out. And Ted went to the trouble here to actually show and demonstrate what he talks about in this blog post in this slide here. So here you can see some code that we have in the OnVisible event. And then we have this little chart that talks about, oh, let me go back here, what's actually happening. So this is a really good pattern you can use to load data from the server when you open up a page in PowerApp. So first, show your preloader animation. You can see that as the first line of code there. And then go to the server and load the data back and put it into a local collection. After you get that data into your local collections, then go ahead and hide that animation that said that you were loading the data. And then after that, you can actually go and load data that you might use in subsequent screens as well. Many of the PowerApps sample templates you'll find on web.powerapps.com, they use this pattern right here, where they load data ahead of time so that when you get to the next screen, it's already there and that screen loads up really quickly. The next pattern that Mehdi points out is how to load data with local caching. And so in this pattern here, you try to load the data first using that load data function from the local device's storage. And then if you don't have that data, then you follow the same pattern we talked about before, where you show the preloader animation, go get the data, and then hide the preloader. If you already do have the data in local storage, then you don't even need to do that, and you can move straight on to doing whatever else you need to do. One thing to point out about load data and save data here. They do save data inside of local storage inside of your PowerApp, but they do not work when you're using a PowerApp in the web browser. So if you're targeting a PowerApp that needs to use the web browser, this is not a pattern you're going to use. But if your PowerApps are always going to be run from inside of the PowerApps client, then you can use this pattern. And the third pattern is concurrent calls. This is a really cool capability inside of PowerApps. And I've got a little demo I'm going to show you about this in just a second. And so instead of writing code where you go and you get data, like you can see on the left side down here in the page, this is actually code from my demo I'm going to show you. The first thing I do is I just set a variable on when did I start all these operations, and at the end doing the same thing. But here what I'm doing is I'm getting items from 2 different SharePoint or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different SharePoint lists. And then I'm fetching emails from the Office 365 Exchange connector. And then I'm going to get some notebooks from the OneNote connector. And then I'm going to get all my plans from the Planner connector. So sometimes your PowerApps really may need this much data on one page to fulfill your requirements. If you execute all those things one at a time, it's going to take a long time. But that's when you can use concurrent. You can see in the slide here where I've used the blue highlight to indicate the only change in this code is where I've introduced using the concurrent function. When you use the concurrent function, every single one of those lines of code within it is going to kick off to execute at the exact same time. Once they're all finished executing, then the code will continue to the next line of code in your PowerApp. And this can really, really improve your performance. So I'm going to show you a little demo of this one firsthand, because it is a nice demo to show here. It's really quick, and it really illustrates the power of this. Okay, so I've created this little PowerApp that uses that exact same code you just saw on the previous slide. And I usually warm my demos up beforehand, but on purpose today, I did not warm this up because PowerApps connectors do a little caching under the hood. And I'm going to show you what happens the very first time you load this app and you click the button and show you the difference. When I click at the top, I'm now going to go query every one of those data sources. And as each one is queried, you can see the values in that little box with the dots around it showing up. So it's going out, it's finding all those items. It just found 28 notebooks, 11 plans, and it got my profile back. So check it out. That took 17 seconds to happen. Well, what happens if I run that concurrently? 1 second. So you're going to notice this amazing difference on the first load of the Power App every time. However, let's say I click that button again now. There's some caching going on under the scenes. So I just clicked it. It only took 2 seconds. But if I do concurrent, I'm still faster. I'll click the top one again and show you how this can vary. Usually, actually, that's amazing. That's the first time I've ever seen it go in 1 second. Usually it's always 2 or 3 after the initial load is how many seconds it takes. Yep, like that. And then the bottom one always takes 1. So that's a really good example of how you can use concurrent inside of your app. And again, there's that same code we saw. No concurrent call here, but down at the bottom, there's the concurrent function. So that's it for what I'm going to talk through with everybody today. Ted, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you share some more goodness on coding guidelines with everybody here today.
Okay, maybe you can just give me some feedback. Are you able to see my slides there and design screens with relative styling?
I sure can.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up where Todd left off, kind of talk about what I felt a couple of best practices. And the first one is kind of simple, takes a little bit of time to set up. It's called relative styling. Now, let's go ahead and kind of move over to an example. So I have this very simple Canvas app inside here. I've got it opened up. So I take this top visual right here. And so, or top control, LBL first name label. And so what you're going to see is that all these other controls, if I go and I look at something, such as the X and the Y property, are all going to be based off this other control. Now, some of the benefits is that now I can kind of move this over. Things are going to move over there with me. I've got the size of the font synced up inside here, so being able to kind of quickly move around gets to be important. And one of the things that you'll see is that when you start using relative styling, let's go here and look at something like the width property. So everything here is working great until I go to this control and I bump the width property, and all of a sudden it's no longer relative, but I've hard coded something inside there. So I've kind of blown it, so the idea is kind of leave things in place. If I kind of do a quick demo here, let's add something that's blank. Let's go ahead and insert a gallery. And with this gallery, let's say that we go ahead and we add some new data. And so the data, I'm just going to kind of import something from Excel to do something quickly right here. So we're going to go ahead and add this data inside, and that's what we want. We want the products table. That's great. Let's go ahead and edit our fields. And so one of the things that I want to show here is that, let's say that I pick, something, one of these inside, and then we have a subtitle, and let's put that at category inside here. Now, when I come inside here and I grab this and I move this around, notice that it's using the relative styling there. So not only can you use it yourself, but understand when it's in place, and don't do something such as move this text box down around. If I take this and I kind of move its X and Y property, I've kind of undone all the relative styling. Okay, now the next thing that I want to do is I want to go through and kind of show a bigger sample. Now there is this URL right here, and here's the GitHub repo. And one of the things I wanted to show is that if you wanted to kind of recreate what I'm going to do here, there's a GitHub repo. There is a SQL file here. So I just have a regular SQL database. I'm creating a customers table, orders table. You can just create an Azure SQL database and run these. And basically what it's going to do, it's going to create a schema, a little watered down, but we're going to have customers, then we're going to have orders, and we're going to have order details with products inside. Okay, now let's go back and kind of take a look at how this is going to get set up. Note that I have a custom connector that's part of this demo. If I go and kind of look at custom connectors, I have a very simple custom connector here, and you're going to kind of see this when the demo starts. And I just have this web service that's available, at this URL. Once again, I'm going to give you plenty of URLs as we go through this today. But every time you hit this URL, it just basically gives you a random customer. So I have a web service that takes, the 1,000 most popular girl names, boy names, fake companies, and puts that back inside there. Okay, now the application I'm going to show is the customer ordering app. So let's go ahead and kind of see how this application works. So first we can browse customers. And the idea is that if I want to create a new customer, here's kind of where we get to use the custom connector. I hate typing in sample data, so we can just kind of call this and just kind of keep going until I find a customer whose name looks kind of cool. So let's go ahead and take that particular customer. Once we've done that, we now want to go to a shopping cart for this customer. So here's where I have my different products inside here. And we want to take, a couple Batman action figures, add that, the G.I. Joe action figure. We now want to go ahead and check out. So here's my order date information. We'll go ahead and submit the order inside here. And basically, we should have pushed a new row. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to kind of go through and kind of see how some of these pieces were put together. So one of the main things we want to look at is designing state inside your application. So collections, if you've used PowerApps for any amount of time, you've had to at least create simple collections. But collections allow you to, take rows from a table in SQL or to prepare rows that you want to push into SQL and start working with those. Todd also up front talked about context variables and global variables. But in this application, we want to use galleries as much as possible. So things like the toolbar that allows us to search, the screen that shows the customers, the screen that shows the products, how we're showing the shopping cart, everything is a gallery, and it's really how we structure the data behind. So let's start with something simple. So let's kind of see how this search functionality is put together. So here, if we go and we take a look at this one particular browse customer screen, let's go ahead and take a look at this one particular nav bar. So we go down here and we kind of see the search buttons, and note that I just kind of have items and I just have the alphabet inside there. And then, let's see if we can kind of really drill inside here. If we go and look at each of these buttons, its text is just going to be what is the current item, and then we're going to update this local variable. And if I click on clear filter, it's basically going to set that, equal to a blank. And then the last piece up here is, how do we set the items inside there? And so here's something saying, if that is blank, let's show all the customers. If I was working with an application that had a gazillion customers, I won't show all the customers by default, but it's just kind of a sample app. But you can kind of see the filter, and as someone starts typing inside there, we're going to be able to do that particular type of filtering. I filter for M, great. I filter for M, O, and we click on the search, or we clear it out. And all of a sudden we've got a search pattern. Okay, now let's look at something a little bit more difficult. So I want to be able to browse the products inside here. Now this product list comes from our database. However, one of the things that we're going to do, and let's go ahead and kind of look in app.start, is that we're going to load in the products table, but yet there's this issue. And the issue is I want to be able to go to each of these products and change the quantity. So how do you do that? So you can't really do it behind the gallery itself. If I do it with a global variable, if I change the quantity for one, I change it for all. So we kind of need this variable that kind of lives in the row of the product. And the way that we're going to do that is that when we load in our data, we're going to add this one other column, and that is going to be the quantity column for each product. So you're not writing back to the database, you're just kind of changing something that's inside of memory. And the final piece here, if we go and kind of look at our up arrow right here, we're going to use the patch. So we're going to basically say, let's patch into this particular collection. And one of the things I really like doing is, let's go back, behind the scenes. Let's look at the product catalog, and you can kind of see that if I scroll all the way over here, we've added the quantity, and now that can be, moved, incremented, decremented, and whatnot. Okay, now let's keep going. I just kind of showed search. we showed something a little bit trickier when you're loading in a collection and you want some value, to be able to change. You simply add extra columns in memory. Okay, now let's look at this shopping cart. So we're going to take two different screens, and both of them are filling out this collection behind the scenes. So when we're using browse products, here's something where when I click add to cart, we're basically going to add into our shopping cart collection. What's the product ID? What is the product? What is the quantity? And note, since I'm just shoving a row inside of a collection, if I want to just go ahead and add calculated columns on the way, that's fine. So basically every time we push something in here, now we have a gallery that's just looking at our shopping cart. I have the empty shopping cart button, couldn't be easier, but this allows us to, basically, have something where let's clear out the shopping cart. Now let's go ahead and, add some different things, into the shopping cart. And now let's go ahead and go to the checkout. So once again, you can kind of see that, what we've really done in browse products is just to basically build out the shopping cart. Mm-hmm. Now in the submit order screen, that's where we're going to do the work to take this shopping cart that we basically put into our collection, and we're going to basically write it back into that SQL database. Now back here, let's kind of take a look at submit order. So the idea is when we click submit order, we want to basically push some data through there. Now, let's say that I go back here to that one particular screen, and that is the submit order screen, and we'll take a look at this. Now, some people like to use edit forms. Some people like to use patch. Todd and Chuck and I have this buddy, Shane Young, and I knew Shane Young for 15 years. We go out to dinner occasionally, and all he wants is steak and eggs, or steak and potatoes. And he doesn't like any other kind of food. So when Shane comes to, working with PowerApps, he likes Azure SQL and he likes patch. Doesn't like the edit form, doesn't like chicken parmesan. But the idea is that edit forms can be really helpful and they add value with validation and rules in certain scenarios. But sometimes what you're trying to do is stretching what an edit form can do. And here we're writing to the order. And not only do we have to create the order, but then we have to harvest the ID of that new order so we can basically create these child records. So patch becomes the way to do that. Now, let's go ahead and kind of make this bigger. So there's actually going to be two different things we do. The first thing is we're going to patch, and notice that we can basically go to the orders table, take default, and now I can figure out who's the current customer. I can figure out by looking through the shopping cart and summing the total column, what the total is, what's the order today. And note that this is going to execute. Now, something that a lot of people don't know is when you call patch, there is a return value. So let's say that I call that, and I'm going to push something into call last order. Now, let's go back and kind of take a look at this. So if I go back into the call last order here, what we can see is that it kind of works like an edit form that has a last submitted, but now I've just kind of captured that. And what's important is I know the order ID of 5. So the idea is that the first clear collect is going to run. And by the time this guy has run, we basically trap the return value that has the ID of the new order that's just been created, which then allows us to go through the shopping cart. So now we're going to call for all. So for each item in the shopping cart, we're going to do an independent patch, and note that we're able to kind of move into that last order collection, take the first record, and there should only be one, and grab the order ID and basically push that inside there. And the last part is after we run this, let's go look at collections. So I also have last order details inside here. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to show a final screen. We get to the order confirmation screen. You don't want to show the shopping cart. You don't want to show the user the data that you wish and hope went into the database successfully. You want to basically take the return of the patch statement, so you kind of get the guarantee that I'm showing the data that I know was successfully pushed into the database. Okay. Now, if you want to get this sample up and going, the one thing I wanted to do is kind of pass that GitHub info to you so you could create this database. And there is a Swagger file to create that custom connector. And then there is a zip file that basically is the Canvas app that you could upload. Okay. What do I have time-wise? Do I have 3 or 4 more minutes, Todd? We doing okay?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay. So the last thing that we wanted to look at here is working with components. So here's kind of the populating the UI from cache state when we get to the submit order form. And then we basically got all the data that we need, to kind of confirm to the user. The last thing I want to do here is talk about components. And I know on a previous call, you've already talked about components. You've had some of the masters from the product team come and, show you what they're doing. And I want to kind of show an example here where we have a component that basically is going to allow us to create a top nav banner. Now, components are really for 2 very different reasons. The main reason they're creating components and the tougher problem to solve is we want to create a component that's independent of any Canvas app or model-driven app, and I want to be able to use it across every single one. There's also a much simpler use case that I'm using here where I'm creating a component just within a single Canvas app because I want a UI, component that I can basically use across every single screen, and a toolbar is an obvious one. So as I basically look at the different screens, you can see that, each screen, has this component. Now, when it comes to components, remember that if I go back to app settings and advanced settings, if I go under preview features, it's not there, but then you get to experimental, which is kind of like preview features. So these have a high likelihood of changing. Also note that when you turn this on, proof of concepts are great for you to create. It's a little too early for you to kind of start putting these, into your production applications, but it's never too early to start thinking about, how to use them. So I wanted to show one use case. Now, the way that components work, inside of a component, you can't reference a screen of the hosting Canvas app. So what you end up having to do, is create custom properties. If I have a component, notice that I can create lots of different properties. I can create one for screen. So if I wanted to kind of hard code things, I could have properties for screen 1 and screen 2. Note that within the component, the default property for one of these will always be app.activeScreen. So it's just kind of a placeholder for that particular type. But we want to be a little bit more dynamic. So we're going to add something that's a table. We're going to add a property based on a table, which is called navigation table. Now, when you create this property, you get to specify the default value. Once again, in the component, we have to use app.activeScreen, but you also get to create the schema for the rows inside of this table. And what that allows us to do, is to basically build this navigation. Let's kind of go back to screens. And so even though this component is going to be placed on every screen and has to be initialized on each screen, one of the things that we could do is in app.start, here's where we can create, the navigation table inside here. And the idea is we create the navigation table and we apply, and every single screen can basically just kind of push this. So as I end up copying this from, one screen to another, the only thing that really has to change, is going to be the screen title. Hopefully we'll be able to get ActiveScreen.title sometime soon. That's not available yet. I've heard the team talking about putting that inside there. But the idea here is that, you want to be able to create, these components, and you don't want to have to copy and paste across screens, as we've been doing, and components kind of give us a lot of promise for that. Now, as we move forward with components, they're going to add support for connections, so creating things like the generic people picker. They're going to add parameterization support, so they're going to get a lot more mature. And so I just, recommend to everybody, keep an eye out, start working with them, because within a year, they're going to be a mainstream best practice, to be able to use them for common UI across screens and across Canvas apps and model-driven apps. And I think, Todd, that kind of brings me to what I wanted to talk about today.
That's great. Thanks, Ted. One thing to loop back to one of the patterns that you showed before, you showed how you put the number of items that they were going to order into the cart in the collection there.
Right.
And I've used that same approach before to flag things in different rows in a gallery to say how we used to do way back in the VB day of like, is it clean or dirty? You remember that?
Yeah.
So you can, and that's very helpful because if somebody makes an edit to an item in a grid of many different columns and rows, you can flag it as such. And then later, when they click a button and maybe go to the next page, you can detect which one of them has changes made to it and then loop through it and do patch.
That's true. It's just a common pattern. And
Mm-hmm.
someone shows it to you, it's so obvious.
Yeah.
But it's so hard to figure out on your own.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
it comes in so handy in so many ways. There's so many times I have a Power App where I have an internal collection and then this collection bound up to other data, and I end up adding columns to it just so I can do those types of things. Definitely. Thanks for sharing all that great information. I love the demo you had wrapped around it. And there were a lot of people asking where they could get your code, and Chuck shared the link with them there. So thanks for sharing all that example too. That's great. Let's move on here to the last bit of the call here. And our next bit is, where can you get all this stuff? So here are the links to the PowerApps Canvas app coding standards and guidelines white paper, where Ted and I really pulled all these topics from that we highlighted today. And then Ted also has another video he did on this too that talks about other pieces we didn't talk about today. There's some overlap, a lot of overlap in that video and this one, but there are other things you can learn in there as well. And then an important thing to point out is Ted and I didn't cover every single thing inside of that white paper. We could probably do another one of these entire community calls on the things we didn't cover that are in the white paper, right, Ted?
I think we could.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. So definitely check that out. I think you'll all learn a lot about that. And I'm going to be talking to Pat about possibly updating that with some more information. So thanks again to Ted. Really appreciate you being here today and sharing all your knowledge and demos and code with all of us. That's awesome. And then we're going to jump over into recent news in PowerApps land. So it's been a busy month in PowerApps, especially because the Microsoft Business Application Summit happened a couple weeks ago, and there were many announcements there. And so here's many of those announcements. First, there's this new thing called the AI Builder for the Power Platform. And I believe I saw Daniel Christian do a tweet, a demo out on this. I've seen some other people in the community talk about using this. I've seen a lot of demos on using the image recognition capabilities of that so far. The next one may not sound like a big deal, but if you ever need sample data for a Power App, this Northwind Traders relational data sample is awesome because it will actually populate a CDS schema with some custom entities in there and put in data from the good old Northwind example. So if you're looking to make Power Apps and you need some sample data, I would definitely check that out. I've already used that one myself, and it works as advertised. Then there's this new thing coming called Power App Portals, which will allow you to share websites built in Power Apps with external users. It's not available yet, but it will be soon, and that is possibly the biggest news I've seen in Power Apps since the components, in my opinion. There's the JSON for Canvas apps, and I just realized I forgot the link to Paul Cumpsey's blog post. I will update it in here before we post this slide deck. But this is essentially a new function that allows you to convert the contents of a collection into JSON. And Paul demonstrates really exceptionally well in his blog post a real use case on why you would want to use that. Not hard at all either. And then finally, there's been something called Confirm Exit added for Canvas PowerApps, and this allows you to prompt your user, did you really mean to close me, before they leave? And again, I forgot to add the link. I made a YouTube video about that one as well, so I'll get that added in there before we post this deck. Finally, combing through the community contributions, last week I found that April, Mariano, and DeWall have also all shared with the PowerApps CC community hashtag here. April made a business card reader. Mariano made a Google Maps component. So that's pretty sweet. I know a lot of PowerApps could use that. And DeWall, he retweeted so many things with this hashtag. I couldn't even list them all on one slide. So thanks for sharing all the goodness, and keep an eye out for this hashtag because it's always filled with great things coming from the community. So to sum up our call here today, we'd always like to give out our tips on what we talked about. The best practice tips, my top 3 are: take the time to really implement and adhere to those naming conventions for screens and controls in your app. It will make them much more supportable and much easier for you to develop as you're building them, and in the future if you have to come back to one again. Know those patterns we talked about for loading data to optimize your performance. It's very easy to use the wrong pattern in PowerApps because they're so easy to build and you don't have to think as you're building them a lot of time. Think about these patterns ahead of time, put them in place in your PowerApp the first time you build it. The final one is one I didn't talk about today, but I have an upcoming YouTube video and a sample app actually coming out for this. And this is implement error handling and logging in your PowerApps. I have talked with many people who say, my PowerApp is broken, can you help us fix it? And every single time I find out they have not built in error handling or logging in their PowerApp. If you want to be able to fix your PowerApps when they break, put in an error handling mechanism and put in logging so you can gather telemetry about that PowerApp and how people are using it. Ted, what are your top 3 tips?
Well, I showed relative styling, so I would encourage everyone to kind of embrace what relative styling is. Because sometimes you'll use it yourself, and it does seem like a lot of work up front, but it tends to pay you back once you've set it up. And then when you're using some of the galleries that have templates that use relative styling, just kind of go with the flow, understand that it's there, and try to leverage it instead of fighting it. Second, defining, when I started designing Canvas apps, I really felt that once I got the hang of creating, the design of the collections and the variables in memory, everything flowed from there. Now, I know that PowerApps is not a tool for developers, and developers have this library called React.js, but I keep thinking that the more I use PowerApps, the more it's like React.js, where you just design the whole application up front in terms of state, and then you basically do all your rendering from the state, and then you basically just have these event handlers that change the state. And that pretty much kind of takes me through most of my design issues. The other thing is that edit forms, for simple scenarios, add plenty of value. But I have this litmus test. Once 1, 2, or 3 things go wrong, I'm going to ditch the edit form and just basically build out a screen and use ROAR controls and basically just do patches. And the obvious example that I showed, is when you have a transaction that involves having a parent record, harvesting the ID, and then using that ID to create 3 child records. There's no way that you could really automate that with edit forms without really fighting how, they were designed. And those are my tips today.
Right on. Ted, with the relative styling, a couple things to add on to that for the folks on the call today. A really good example of that one is the get on board, or it might be renamed onboarding tasks, PowerApps sample template that you find on web.powerapps.com. That one has been built with all relative styling. That was one of our requirements. And another thing related to relative styling is, boy, does that come in handy if you're using responsive design in your PowerApps too.
Absolutely.
All right.
Some nice progress into giving us more support, to create those type of responsive apps, where a year ago it's like, forget, it's not worth it, build 2 apps. And now as they're starting to add more things, into just the property set of the screens and the controls, it really is giving us the ability to create truly responsive applications that take up the whole browser or reduce down to the mobile device.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. It's so easy to do too. It's just amazing. So thanks everybody. Thanks for joining. We really appreciate everybody in the chat and everybody watching. We hope everything we shared with you today, or at least a lot of it, comes in handy for you. This recording will soon be available on the Office Developer YouTube. Chuck, it's actually available at the exact same link you're watching it on right now, right?
That is correct. Okay. Matter of fact, as soon as I hit the stop button, you can rewind it.
All right, great. So our next call comes about a month from today. So that will be July 17th at 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. And it looks like we need to wrap this up now. And I do see a couple questions in chat. People, looks like they've been getting to all of them. Chuck, did you see any that we need to talk about out loud here today?
No, between Ikiel Mendoza, Mariana Gomez, Belinda, API guy, Keith Crago, these guys have been knocking them out in real time. So thank you guys. We really, and Daniel Christian, of course. Thank you guys. Really appreciate the help.
That's awesome. Well, cool. Well, I guess we'll call it a wrap then. Thanks, everybody. Thanks again, Ted, and we'll see y'all next month.
Sounds great. Thanks.